A flare gun cracked through the cold air. One red streak, then silence. On the shore of Raven Isle, a man crawled toward a stolen seaplane, bleeding into the sand, whispering, "Please, don't leave me here." I was there. I watched Bear, Jonas Hale's German shepherd, stand frozen, ears locked on that man like he knew a truth the rest of us didn't. But only days earlier, Jonas was just a 46-year-old loner flying supply runs along the San Juan Passage, searching for quiet the world never gave him, until Bear jolted awake mid-flight, until they saw the 3 giant letters carved into the beach. SOS. A cry for help loud enough to shake a man's soul. Then the island answered with something cruel. A torn campsite, blood in the tree line, a journal soaked with rain and fear, and a stranger stumbling out of the woods, shivering, saying, "They took her. I couldn't stop them." No authorities came. No boats. No voices calling back. Just that island, keeping its secrets. And yet, in all that quiet, hope moved. One step, one man, one dog who refused to look away. What Bear sensed that day changed everything. Before we begin, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from, and how does this story make you feel? I want to know how far this journey travels across our world. The morning broke with a thin metallic hush, the kind of muted light that hangs over Puget Sound when winter has stripped the world of color, leaving only shades of steel and breathless blue. A low wind pressed itself along the water as if trying to wake something long asleep, and the seaplane's engine answered with a rough, familiar vibration that settled into the bones more than into the ears. For a moment, all one could feel was the slow, steady pulse of machine against sky, a rhythm so even it seemed capable of holding back the memories Jonas Hale spent years trying to outrun. Then the sound thinned, became a fragile thread in the open air, and the world around him widened into a quiet too deep to ignore. Jonas sat with the posture of someone who had learned to coexist with silence rather than trust it. His shoulders were squared beneath the olive M1965 field jacket he always wore when flying, its frayed military patch and faded flag catching the faint gray light. He had the look of a man carved out of endurance. Mid-40s, tall, lean, the sharp edges of his jaws softened only by the muted salt and pepper beard that came from years rather than style. His eyes, cold gray blue, stayed steady on the horizon as if any flicker might unlock something he didn't wish to face. But beneath that stillness was a tension you could feel if you stood close. Like the air just before lightning touches water, Bear lay curled in the co-pilot seat, his sable gray coat blending into the shadowed cabin as though carved from the same winter light. He was 6 years old, an age where strength and intuition meet in a dog. And even in sleep he held a kind of alertness, ears angled just enough to catch what Jonas might miss. The dog breathed evenly, the rise of his chest matching the gentle sway of the plane, as if anchoring the aircraft itself against whatever storms lived behind Jonas's steady hands. For a long stretch, nothing moved but the islands drifting slowly beneath them. Hundreds of dark shapes scattered across the sound like forgotten stones. The thin strips of shoreline glimmered faintly under the pale sun, and the forests inland huddled close and silent. Jonas flew low enough that he could smell brine on the wind, a salt-hollowed scent that seeped into the cockpit whenever the breeze shifted. He made this route so often it felt like tracing an old scar, one that no longer bled but never quite disappeared. The mornings here were familiar, predictable, merciful. And predictable was the only kindness life still owed him. But then Bear lifted his head. No sound, no growl, just a sharp, sudden movement. the kind that starts in the spine before the mind understands. And his ears locked forward with a precision that cut through Jonas's fog of thought. The dog stared out the window, muscles tight, gaze fixed downward as if something on the island below had called his name. Jonas felt it before he saw it. A shift in air pressure, a faint catch of breath. "What is it, boy?" The words slipped out soft, unplanned, not meant for conversation, but for memory. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting the plane's angle. The glass in front of him was smudged with sea mist, but through it he caught the edge of Raven Isle. One of the tiniest, most untouched patches of land in the entire Sound. Barely a dot on any map. Nothing there. Nothing living. Nothing built. Nothing worth stopping for. Except Bear was still staring. Jonas eased the plane lower, letting the engine settle into a deeper tremor. The island's shape came into sharper focus. A sickle of pale sand meeting a wall of dark pines, the trees hunched inward like an old secret. He squinted, trying to trace what the dog had sensed. At first, he saw only driftwood and kelp mapped across the beach. But then the plane shifted in the wind, aligning him with the shoreline at a new angle. And three shapes jumped out of the monotone landscape with a starkness that made his stomach drop. 3 letters, too straight to be accidental, too large to be ignored, formed from thick logs dragged out from the tree line, arranged with desperate precision. SOS. The letters looked raw against the sand, each one a silent cry pressed into the earth by hands that had run out of any other way to be heard. Jonas tightened his grip on the controls, feeling the cold metal respond under his fingers. The message was unmistakable. Someone had been stranded or injured or worse. Someone had reached for the oldest call for help a human could carve into the world. But a deeper instinct in Jonas whispered something else. This was not new, and whatever happened here had not ended well. He breathed in once, deeply, letting the cold settle in his chest. A familiar pull rose inside him, that tight strand of reluctance formed from too many times he had arrived too late. The sky around him felt heavier, pressing for a decision he wasn't ready to make. A single turn of the wheel could take him past it, back to his quiet route, back to a life without strangers' tragedies. Bear turned his head. For a moment, dog and man held each other's gaze. There was nothing pleading in Bear's eyes, nothing dramatic, only a steady, steady knowing. As if the dog remembered something Jonas had forgotten. The weight of a life held in your hands. The responsibility of sight. The duty that stays even when the uniform is long gone. Jonas inhaled slowly and nudged the plane downward. The descent felt like sinking through a frozen river. The air grew wet and heavy, brushing cold against the windows. Waves lapped at the island's curved shore, tapping against driftwood like a slow heartbeat. The plane's pontoons hit the water with a crack that echoed along the beach, sending sharp sprays of foam into the air. Jonas guided the aircraft toward the shallow cove, letting it drift until the engine died into silence. The moment the propeller stopped turning, the world seemed to expand, sound returning like breath after holding it too long. Jonas opened the cockpit door, and the cold rushed in. It smelled of pine needles, salt, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. He stepped onto the plane's pontoon, boots sinking slightly as the water rocked him. Bear jumped down after him, landing with a soft splash, the fur along his back rising as his nose tested the wind. The dog's tail held low, not in fear, but in the kind of focused tension that meant he had already sensed something Jonas hadn't. The shoreline stretched out before them, pale and quiet. Not a single gull circled above, not a trace of movement among the trees. But the sand told a different story. Several footprints, irregular, hurried, cut across the beach, some deep enough that water pooled in their centers. Near the largest log of the SOS message, the sand was darker, clumped, disturbed. Jonas walked toward it slowly, each step measured. A faint trail of red, thin as thread but unmistakable in its persistence, ran from the message toward the woods. It glinted where sunlight caught it, a narrow shimmer leading into dark pines. Bear's growl was almost inaudible, a vibration more than a sound. His body angled toward the forest, muscles coiled as if waiting for a signal that had yet to be given. Jonas exhaled once, long and steady. The island was silent, too silent. And somewhere in that silence, something had already begun watching them back. The first step Jonas took onto the sand carried the kind of weight that only silence can give. A silence so complete it pressed against the ears like deep water and made each breath feel heavier than the last. The forest ahead rose in a dark, unmoving wall, the trunks wet with morning mist and the shadows between them thick enough to swallow entire memories whole. A thin thread of wind drifted through the pines, brushing their needles in a slow, weary sigh, as though something hidden inside the island was trying to speak but no longer had the strength to form words. Bear moved beside him with a low, deliberate pace, his nose close to the ground, ears shifting to catch faint movements Jonas could not hear. There was a trail, faint but undeniable. Patches of sand disturbed into uneven crescents, scattered pine needles crushed under weight. And that thin, rust-colored line threading between them like the last mark of someone who had fought to stay alive. Jonas crouched without speaking, his fingers brushing the dry blood, feeling the brittle edges of it, the way it cracked under touch like old paint. It had been there for days at most, long enough to lose its shine, not long enough to forget what had caused it. He lifted his hand slightly, watching the wind carry a few tiny flakes of dried red into the air. And in that motion, there was something like a quiet acknowledgement of suffering, of desperation, of a plea carved into earth and now scattered into sky. Bear nudged forward, tracing the broken trail toward the tree line with a confidence built not from eagerness, but from certainty. The certainty of an animal who understood distress without ever needing to be taught the word. Jonas followed, stepping from the cool sand into soil that smelled of rot and rain, the transition abrupt like stepping into a room where someone had just left. The forest swallowed them quickly. From behind, the beach faded into a pale smudge, the sky overhead narrowing into thin ribbons of light weaving through the branches. The deeper they moved, the more the air shifted, heavier, denser, as if the island were holding its breath. It didn't take long to find what the trail pointed to. A campsite lay crumpled beneath the low wings of fir trees, the ground uneven with fallen duff and the remnants of a life abruptly disrupted. The tent had been split open down one side, the fabric torn in jagged, forceful strokes that suggested someone didn't have time to unzip it properly, or someone didn't care to. Clothes lay scattered in damp piles. A pot, its blackened bottom scarred from long use, lay sideways with cold ash clinging to its rim. A metal kettle was overturned near the fire pit, its spout half buried in mud, where water must have spilled and soaked into the earth. Jonas approached slowly, his eyes scanning the ground and the way a seasoned tracker might follow a story written in footprints. The world around him felt strangely suspended, as if the moment before, violence had been frozen here and left in place for him to find. A single pair of shoes rested just inside the collapsed tent. Women's shoes, laces tied neatly, as if their owner had stepped out for only a second before something forced her to never return. The sight carved something sharp and thin into Jonas's chest. The small details of ordinary life, left behind in a place that had never known the ordinary. Bear moved ahead, weaving around the posts of the tent with slow precision. He pressed his nose against a bundle of blankets, inhaled, then stiffened, not with fear, but with recognition. There was a scent here that did not belong to a peaceful camp. Jonas felt the tension radiating off the dog like heat from a struck match. And he stepped closer, scanning the ground until something caught his eye beneath a rain-soaked tarp tossed aside near the fire pit. A corner of paper, swollen, wrinkled, the ink bled through in spider-like veins. Jonas knelt, lifted the tarp carefully, and found a small notebook, the kind someone might keep for lists or sketches or private thoughts meant for no one else. The cover was softened by water, its edges curled, but it opened easily under his hands. The first page displayed neat handwriting, slanted slightly to the right, steady even though the paper had warped. Day 1. My name is Marin. Our boat went under in the storm. Liam hurt his leg badly. I built the SOS. Someone must see it. Someone has to see it. Jonas turned the page. The handwriting trembled, the letters uneven, as though written in the dark or with numb fingers. The loneliness in the words seeped through the paper more sharply than the ink. Day 3. Fire won't catch. Liam is burning up. The wind keeps whispering. Sounds like people. Maybe it's just the trees. I don't know anymore. He felt the air shift in his lungs as he read, a slow tightening like grief that didn't belong to him, but still clung to him, as if demanding to be carried. He flipped to the next section, where the ink had blurred into soft stains, entire lines melting into each other, but a few jagged words held form. Day 6. They came. Not rescue. Another boat. Heard yelling. Heard dragging. They said they'd come back to finish it. If someone finds this, please. We're still alive. For a long moment, Jonas didn't breathe. It wasn't the words alone, but the space between them, the fear of someone writing in a hurry, the sense that time had run out even before the sentence ended. He closed the notebook slowly, holding it as if it were something fragile, something that could break further just from the weight of his touch. When he exhaled, the breath trembled once, not from cold, from memory. Bear let out a low shiver, a subtle roll of tension under his fur. His muscles drew taut, his stance sharpening like an arrow knocked into a bowstring. He had turned toward something deeper in the woods, his entire body pointing in that direction with the unerring clarity of instinct. Jonas looked up from the notebook, his senses aligning with the dog's tension, and that was when he saw it. Half hidden under fallen pine needles, the dull sheen of metal catching a sliver of light. He moved toward it carefully, parting the needles with a slow sweep of his hand. A hunting knife lay there, the blade darkened with dried blood, the hilt marked with scratches from heavy use. The blood had turned black along the grooves, and the faint metallic scent lifted into the air when Jonas lifted it, slicing through the damp forest smell with a note that chilled the back of his throat. He held the knife in his palm, feeling its weight, feeling the echo of whatever force had driven it through flesh. It wasn't dropped. It was left, abandoned at a moment too frantic for its owner to retrieve. Jonas tightened his grip on the blade, the forest pressing closer around him, the wind no longer sighing but stilling entirely, as if the island itself were listening. Then it came. A sound. Soft. Uneven. Not the scamper of an animal or the fall of a pine cone, but something heavier. Something breathing. Something moving with intention. Bear stepped backward, positioning himself between Jonas and the direction of the noise, his back rising into a stiff ridge, his posture tall and unwavering, like a living barricade. The sound came again. Faint, deliberate, and human. The sound came again, thin at first, then dragging itself across the forest floor like something trying to remember how to move. The trees stood rigid around Jonas, swallowed in a pale wash of winter light that slipped between branches in narrow, trembling lines. Bear lifted one paw, holding it suspended in the air, nose pointed forward, body leaning just enough to show that whatever approached was not coming with the steadiness of footsteps, but with the uneven weight of someone dragging themselves toward breath. The wind scraped through needles overhead, brittle and sharp, carrying a coldness that felt older than the island itself, the kind of cold that warned before it touched skin. A figure emerged from the crevice of two leaning stones, slowly, painfully, the way a wounded animal might force itself into daylight. Jonas watched the man pull himself forward, elbows digging into moss and dirt, face drained of color until it matched the pale rock behind him. His hair clung in wet clumps to his forehead, his cheeks hollowed as if hunger had carved out what should have been fear. His right pant leg was shredded from thigh to shin, exposing a gash laced with dried and fresh blood, the wound looking both raw and strangely tended. He gasped in stuttering pulls of air, each breath sounding like it might be his last, yet his eyes, wide, sharp, awake, watched Jonas with a careful study of someone counting the spaces between movements. "Where's Marin?" The words slipped out in a frayed whisper, too thin to belong to a scream, too deliberate to belong to someone fading. Jonas moved forward slowly, lowering himself to one knee beside the man, his hands steady even though the air seemed to pulse around them with the tension of something not fully seen. Bear circled once, hackles raised in a subtle ridge, but not lunging forward. The controlled restraint of a dog who knew the difference between fear and recognition. The man lifted his head enough that the weak light caught the features of his face. Early 30s, maybe slightly older beneath the exhaustion, skin dulled with cold, dark stubble along his jaw, hair unkempt, clothing torn but not uniformly so. His shirt was smeared with dirt, yet the collar remained intact. His jacket was ripped high across the shoulder, but the zipper looked recently handled, not weather-worn. Jonas leaned closer to the wound, his fingers hovering a breath above the torn fabric. The cut was deep, yes, but the edges were clean. Too clean for the chaos suggested by the campsite. The skin around it bore the faint rectangle imprint of medical tape, adhesive marks that hadn't fully faded. Someone had wrapped it properly at some point. Someone had removed the bandage later on. Not a wound from running blindly through the woods. Not a wound left untreated in panic. A wound crafted for a narrative. The man winced, though the movement seemed almost delayed, as if his body were performing pain rather than reacting to it. Jonas looked up, meeting the man's eyes again, and saw something flickering beneath the surface. Not fear, not desperation, but calculation. The cold spark of someone testing how much truth the other person was ready to accept. Bear let out a low, simmering growl, not loud, not threatening, but deep, a sound built from memory, not instinct. His tail stiffened, his posture tightened, and for a moment he stood perfectly still except for the subtle tremor of muscles gathering beneath fur. Jonas opened his pack, took out a water bottle, and held it out with a calmness that only long years of hardship could forge. The man reached for it too quickly, too eagerly for someone half-conscious. Jonas didn't pull it back, but he watched the movement with the same measured stillness a fisherman might watch a shifting tide. The man drank shakily, letting water spill down his chin in practiced clumsiness. "My name is Liam," he said, panting softly. Please help me." Jonas did not answer. He merely let the silence settle, a silence so complete it forced the forest to reveal its smallest noises. Bear edged closer, placing himself between Jonas and the man with deliberate, protective precision, the way he had done only in the presence of someone he had reason to distrust. His eyes, deep amber and unwavering, locked on the stranger, as though something in the man's scent carried an echo only animals could detect. Jonas studied the stranger's face. Liam, if that was truly his name, looked back with a mixture of exhaustion and something tightly coiled behind it. He appeared young, somewhere around his early 30s, his body lean but not frail, his hands steady except for the shiver he forced into them. His jacket had a tear across the chest, but beneath it, the shirt was only lightly dirtied, not soaked with the grime of someone wandering the forest for days. His boots were scuffed at the toes but clean at the heels, the kind of inconsistency that did not belong to an injured castaway. Jonas placed one hand gently on the man's shoulder, testing how he reacted to physical support. Liam tensed, not from pain, but from anticipation, eyes flicking upward quickly enough to betray the instinct of someone afraid of being read. Jonas recognized that look from the past, from places he wished his memory did not still visit. Moral dissonance rose quietly between them, a wounded man begging for help, and the unmistakable shadow of deceit curled behind his pupils. "Easy," Jonas murmured. Soft, neutral, neither comfort nor warning. Liam blinked, as if surprised Jonas had spoken at all. For a moment, his face softened, the mask slipping just enough to reveal something like uncertainty, or perhaps irritation that his performance wasn't earning the expected response. Jonas wrapped an arm around Liam's back, lifting gently, letting the man lean on him as they began to move through the brush. Bear walked ahead, but only by a few feet, pausing often, glancing over his shoulder, as though pulling at invisible threads of danger only he could sense. The forest around them grew tighter, branches reaching low, the smell of damp earth thickening as they approached the remnants of the campsite Jonas had found earlier. Every few steps, Liam's breathing shifted, too measured, too regular, lacking the ragged unpredictability of someone drifting in and out of consciousness. Jonas noted it silently, his mind tracking each inconsistency the way a tide tracks the moon. They reached the clearing. Jonas motioned for Liam to sit on a fallen log near the tent, its bark softened by rain and rot. Liam lowered himself with exaggerated care, casting quick glances into the darker edges of the forest. His hands trembled in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Bear stood a few paces away, tail level, chest rising in slow, heavy breaths. His eyes flicked from Liam to the tree line and back again, the uneasy vigilance of a guardian who sensed not one danger, but multiple. Jonas unzipped a small medical pouch and crouched beside the man, preparing to clean the wound. Liam watched him, the corners of his eyes tightening, his expression wavering between gratitude and a simmering alertness. The forest exhaled around them, its breath cold and damp, and for a moment everything grew still. Then Bear froze. Not the stiffening of curiosity, the stiffening of certainty. His body locked, muscles drawn up in a single silent warning. Jonas shifted slightly, following the dog's gaze toward the dense patch of fir shadows. The air felt heavier there, as if something pressed against it from the inside. A sudden, sharp crack echoed, a single snap of a branch under weight, impossibly soft, but unmistakably human. Bear stepped forward, fur rising along his spine, his stance forming a barrier between Jonas and the darkened tree line. Someone else was out there. Night slid over Raven Isle in a slow, chilled descent, the sky taking on that faint violet blue that made every shape look washed in cold water. The forest grew heavier with the color, branches losing their edges, shadows stretching long across the ground, as if the island were exhaling everything it had held back during the day. Jonas stood still for a moment, letting the darkness settle around him, listening to the soft drip of melting frost from the needles above. Brief sparkles of sound swallowed as soon as they formed. Bear sat alert at his side, the faint glow of firelight catching in his amber eyes, turning them into two steady lanterns guiding Jonas's uncertain thoughts. The small flame Jonas built crackled low, barely more than a flicker hugging a handful of dry twigs. It was enough to warm the cold around Liam's wound, enough to keep the night air from settling into bone, but not enough to cast a beacon into the forest where someone might be watching. Jonas knelt close to the fire, stretching a hand toward it, feeling the warmth climb up his palm in thin ribbons. The forest had changed. It wasn't the emptiness of isolation anymore, but the quietness that comes when something dangerous is standing just at the edge of sight. Liam leaned against a tree trunk a few feet away, breath ragged, eyes half-lidded, as if slipping in and out of consciousness. But the effort showed. He wasn't falling, he was imitating the fall. His shoulders rose and dropped in rehearsed tremors, and each flinch seemed slightly delayed, as though he were checking Jonas's reaction before committing to the expression. His hands trembled, but only when Jonas looked his way. When he thought he wasn't observed, the trembling stopped. Bear saw it all. The dog's posture never eased, not for a single heartbeat. He sat at the edge of the fire, facing Liam, back turned protectively toward Jonas, his head slightly lowered, his ears angled forward, rigid as a drawn bow waiting to release. He didn't blink, not once, not even when embers snapped and rolled. His breath was low, controlled, the steady rhythm of certainty rather than fear. Jonas unfolded the weather-warped journal he had pulled from the abandoned camp, his thumb tracing the softened edge of the paper as wind brushed the spine like a hand, turning pages on its own. He read silently in the dim light, the words rising off the page with the rawness of someone who wrote them in the dark, with trembling fingers and a mind fraying at the seams. They laughed when they saw us, said a wrecked boat was a gift from the sea, said no one would miss us, said the island would hide what needed hiding. Jonas exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. The sentences weren't the cries of someone imagining fear. They were the breadcrumbs of a truth scattered across sand and rain, and the trembling edges of desperation. His eyes lifted from the page, drifting toward Liam, who was watching him, again, gaze flickering with an intensity he tried to dull behind a mask of pain. The map inside Jonas's mind began to take shape, threading lines across the island, connecting one clue to another. One path led deeper into the forest, toward the real Marin, the woman who had written the journal and had not been found at the camp. The other path ended at the man in front of him, whose lies were stitched into his performance like seams in a costume. Bear, with no words and no hesitation, had already chosen. Jonas didn't need a bark to know it. The night grew colder as the hours crawled past. The fire dwindled to faint red coals that pulsed gently in the dark, like the last heartbeat of a dying star. Jonas rose slowly, rolling his shoulders beneath his weathered olive jacket, the fabric whispering with the movement. He reached for the emergency pack he had prepared earlier, slipping the straps over his shoulders with deliberate quiet. The forest's silence felt thicker now, the kind that presses more firmly the longer one tries to listen through it. He placed a hand softly on Bear's flank. "Bear," he whispered. The dog stood immediately, not a sound, as if he had been waiting for those syllables since the moment Liam crawled into sight. He didn't glance backward. He didn't acknowledge the man on the ground. He simply stepped forward into the darkness, ready to follow whatever scent Memory or instinct was pulling him. Jonas turned to Liam, meeting the man's expectant stare. The firelight trembled across Liam's face, illuminating the sharpness lingering beneath all the forced fragility. Jonas let a quiet beat stretch between them, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," Jonas said. "I'll come back." The sentence hung in the air without promise, without weight, barely even a courtesy. Liam blinked, as though trying to read what Jonas wasn't saying. But Jonas didn't linger long enough for him to decipher anything. He stepped back, nudged the fire down with his boot until only a faint glow remained, then followed Bear into the shadowed forest. The woods wrapped around them, the smell of damp bark and cold earth mixing with the faint chemical tang of old salt blowing in from the coast. Branches creaked gently overhead, the sound almost like murmured warnings from trees that had seen too much and remembered more than humans ever would. Jonas kept close to Bear, letting the dog lead, the space around them tightening into threads of darkness that parted only when Bear pushed through. Their steps whispered against the ground, moss swallowing sound while dead branches snapped softly under Jonas's boots. The air grew sharper the farther north they moved, wind funneling between cliffs and carrying with it a scent Jonas recognized only after a few steps. Oil, diesel, something metallic and restless. Bear slowed, his tail held still, his movements careful. He paused once, then again, before pushing forward with renewed certainty. Jonas followed, climbing over twisted roots and weaving through narrow gaps between fir trunks until the forest abruptly thinned. The trees spread apart as if acknowledging the boundary of something ancient and dangerous. They reached the northern cliff face. Jonas stopped at the edge, boots inches from the drop where the cliff fell sharply toward a dark, restless hollow. The wind surged up the cliff wall, carrying the unmistakable smell of diesel. Burnt, stale, stubborn, clinging to the air like a warning. Beneath the wind's roar, faint but undeniable, came another sound, a metallic clang, then another, rhythmic, insistent, human. Jonas leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. The moon, thin, almost shy, cast a pale glimmer across the rocks below, enough to reveal a shadowed shape wedged between the cliffs. An old boat, its hull dented from impact, trapped in a pocket of rock where waves couldn't fully reach it. The metal on one side shuddered with each strike, as though someone inside was beating against it with feeble but persistent strength. Bear's ears pricked sharply, body angling toward the sound, tail stiff. He gave one low, steady rumble. Not a threat, not fear, but recognition that they had found the source of the island's unanswered plea. Someone was alive. Someone was waiting, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she would never be found. The wind rose first, sharp, salted, and impatient, as Jonas tightened the rope around the nearest tree trunk, testing each knot the way a man tests the truth in another's eyes. The cliffside waited beneath him like a cold spine, slick with mist, its jagged ribs of stone jutting into the night air. He eased himself over the edge, letting gravity take him in short, controlled pulls, his boots scraping the rock face with the sound of steel brushing stone. Above him, the last threads of moonlight cut through the branches, turning Bear's silhouette into a watchful guardian perched on the cliff like a carved figurehead on the bow of a ship. Bear followed seconds later, his descent silent, agile, each movement measured with the certainty of an animal who trusted neither the earth beneath nor the world above. His coat caught the faint gleam of night, a shifting ripple of gray and shadow that slid down the rocks with Jonas, as though the two were tethered by something older than rope. Something like loyalty sharpened by years of survival. The boat came into view gradually. its warped frame jutting from the waves like the skeleton of a whale that had washed ashore centuries ago and refused to disintegrate. It tilted at an angle that made Jonas's stomach knot. The sea slapped its hull in steady, rhythmic blows, rocking it with the stubborn persistence of water reclaiming what didn't belong to the land. The air down here was colder, too. Colder and laced with the thick, oily scent of diesel that clung to the back of the throat. Jonas stepped off the last foothold and dropped lightly onto a patch of wet sand near the stern, the boat looming over him like something wounded and breathing. The wind pressed against his jacket as he scanned the deck, eyes narrowing at the movement of a figure hunched near the engine compartment. A man, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, wearing a torn black fleece jacket soaked with spray, was crouched over an exposed fuel line, muttering curses under his breath. His hands worked fast, competent, the hands of someone who had done this too many times to be clumsy now. A headlamp glowed weakly across his shaved jawline, making the stubble appear silver in the cold light. And when the waves crashed loud enough, he paused to slap the side of the casing, frustrated. Jonas watched him for a heartbeat, two, waiting for some sign of hesitation, some flicker that might suggest he was aware he wasn't alone. But the man heard nothing beyond the engine's protest and the sea's relentless demand. Jonas moved, not fast, not loud, simply precise. He approached from the blind side, boots placing themselves where stone met sand. And before the man could straighten, before breath could become alarm, Jonas hooked his arm around the man's throat in a swift, practiced motion. The struggle was brief and silent. A gasp, a jerk of the shoulders, a twitch of the wrist reaching instinctively toward a concealed waistband. Then, the body went limp, sagging against Jonas like a sack of wet grain. He lowered the man quietly onto the deck, rolling him aside so the shifting waves wouldn't jostle him awake. Bear landed on the boat with a soft thud, nails clicking once against the weathered planks before he was off, nose lowered, weaving instinctively toward the narrow hatch that led below. Jonas followed quickly, his hand brushing the cool metal railing, and as he descended, the sound reached him clearly, no longer muffled by distance or steel. A pounding, weak, desperate, human. The space below deck was cramped, choked with the smell of diesel and old salt, the walls sweating moisture that glistened under Jonas's flashlight. The sound grew louder as he moved past crates lashed with ropes and tarps, his steps steady despite the boat's occasional lurch. Bear was already pressed against a bolted door at the far end, paws braced, ears pinned forward, his low rumble vibrating the narrow hallway. Jonas lifted the crowbar he had found near the hatch, wedged it into the hinge, and leaned with all his strength. Metal groaned, scraped, resisted like something alive trying to hold its secrets. He drove his weight harder, breath steady, and with a sudden crack, the hinge snapped, sending a tremor up his arm. He yanked the door open. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and landed on a woman curled tightly against the far wall, wrists bound, hair matted to her temples with dried salt and sweat. She was young, mid-30s, pale beneath layers of grime, her clothes torn at the sleeves and knees. Her lips were cracked, a dark line at the corner where thirst had split the skin. When the light found her, she recoiled, squinting, until Bear stepped forward and touched his nose softly to her hand. Her breath hitched. Then she shook, sobbed once, and whispered something that broke open in the cramped air like a held breath finally released. Behind her lay a man, thin, feverish, shivering beneath a tattered jacket laid over his torso. His leg was bound with a strip of cloth fashioned from a shirt sleeve, the wound beneath swelling angrily, flesh discolored. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven pulls. Jonas knelt beside him, placing a hand gently against his shoulder, and felt the heat boiling beneath his skin. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with pain, but still fighting, still aware. This was Liam, the real one. Maren, if the journal had been truthful, struggled to sit, her bound hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. Jonas cut the ropes cleanly. She fell forward a little, catching herself on unsteady palms before lifting her gaze to him. Her voice cracked. The man on the island. He's not Liam. He's one of them. He stabbed my husband. He said he'd come back when he saw your plane. Her fingers clenched around Jonas's sleeve, desperation anchoring her. You can't let him near it. Jonas didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The truth lay heavy in the stale air between them, thick as the smell of fuel. Bear gave a short, urgent growl from the doorway. Not sharp, not loud, but the kind that said the world outside had changed while they spoke. Jonas rose instantly, shouldering the emergency pack, tucking a blanket around Liam's shaking frame before lifting him carefully. Maren steadied herself, one hand on the wall, the other clutching Bear's fur as though the dog were the only solid thing left on earth. Jonas helped them climb the narrow stairs, each step rocking with the boat's restless shift. The wind outside had turned, sharper, dragging the taste of danger with it. He felt it before he heard it, a vibration in the air like a distant threat sharpening its edge. Halfway up the ladder, Jonas paused. A sound rolled down the hillside, faint but unmistakable. A sputter, a choke, a cough of ignition that didn't belong to the sea. The sound of a plane engine being forced awake. His plane, the one he had left by the shore, believing he had outrun the lies on this island. Maren stopped breathing. Liam's fingers tightened around Jonas's jacket. Bear turned his head toward the cliff, ears rigid, every muscle locking into stillness. Above them, between the wind gusts, the engine sputtered again, louder this time, strained, uneven, the sound of someone tampering with a machine they didn't understand. And then the truth hit Jonas with the clarity of cold water. The imposter had left the camp the moment Jonas disappeared into the forest. He had followed the coastline. He had gone straight for the aircraft. The boat rocked beneath them as Jonas pulled Maren and Liam onto the deck, his pulse hammering like a second engine in his chest. The wind carried the noise down the cliff one more time. The choke of a starter, a rising whine, a desperate attempt to make a stolen miracle fly. The night held its breath, and the plane engine roared again, louder as someone tried to take it into the sky. The forest opened before them in long, trembling corridors of shadow, each branch brushing Jonas's shoulders like a cold reminder that night was slipping fast and mercy was slipping faster. Maren stumbled once on the uneven ground, her breath cutting short as she clung to a moss-slick trunk, while Liam leaned heavily against Jonas, every step rattling through his fevered body like cracked porcelain shifting inside a thin shell. Bear ran just ahead, his silhouette a streak of gray urgency weaving between trees, pausing only to look back, urging them forward with the silent insistence of an animal who understood that danger was no longer approaching. It was already here. Their footsteps thudded into the wet earth, muffled by pine needles, wrapped in the rough rhythm of fear. The air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked bark and distant seawater, and each breath Jonas drew felt scraped thin, pulled tight by the weight of what he knew waited at the edge of the beach. Even the wind seemed to push them from behind, pressing cold fingers into their backs as if nature itself were urging them faster, faster, before the final line closed. The trees thinned, the forest exhaled, and the shoreline appeared. The seaplane sat at the waterline like a beast roused from sleep, its metal frame shivering under the flicker of cockpit lights. The propeller jerked in uneven coughs, each rotation grinding like teeth gnashing against metal. The engine whined low, stalled, then surged again in a desperate attempt to awaken, as if something inside was forcing it past its natural will. That something turned and saw Jonas. The imposter, no longer the trembling, half-crumbled figure who had begged for help beneath the trees, stood in the doorway of the cockpit, his face stripped of every lie he had worn earlier. Rage twisted his expression into sharp, wet lines. His eyes glowed with the feverish crimson of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. His jaw clenched hard enough to whiten the skin around it, and in the flash of cockpit light, Jonas saw the shape in his hand. A flare gun, dull metal glinting red. Jonas reached instinctively for his sidearm, but his fingers brushed only empty air. He had left it holstered near the fire when he'd carried Liam through the forest, a rare miscalculation that now closed around his chest like a tightening grip. The imposter raised the flare gun, a twitch of his finger, a breath drawn through clenched teeth. And Jonas understood he would not make the next step in time. But Bear didn't need time. One command broke the world open. "Bear!" The word was low, firm, unshaken. And Bear moved. He burst forward like an arrow released, feet pounding the sand in a blur of power and precision, water kicking up behind him as he tore across the beach. The imposter fired, the flare exploding into the air with a ripping shriek, scorching the dark in a streak of furious red. The light sliced downward, toward Bear like a burning omen. Bear twisted mid-stride, body corkscrewing through the air, the flare missing him by inches as it hissed into the waves. He landed with the grace of something born between earth and wind, then launched upward, teeth locking around the man's leg with the force of a crashing tide. The imposter screamed, stumbling from the doorway, tumbling into the shallow surf as Bear dragged him down. The flare gun fell from his grip, bouncing across the sand before sinking with a soft plunk beneath the waterline. The engine sputtered, coughed once violently, then choked. The cockpit lights flickered twice and died, leaving the plane's frame slouched and panting like a creature relieved of a cruel burden. Jonas reached Bear just as the struggle ended. The man lay sprawled in the surf, face pressed to the sand, blood threading through the shallow waves in thin, dark swirls. Bear stood over him, chest heaving, eyes locked with a mixture of instinct and duty. Neither triumphant nor savage, simply resolute. Jonas placed a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the raw tremor of adrenaline beneath the fur. There was no victory here, only necessity. He turned back to Maren and Liam, guiding them toward the open stretch of sand where rescue might find them. The wind shifted again, colder but clearer, and Jonas raised his emergency beacon to the sky. The thin signal pulsed upward, a fragile thread of hope cast into the night. And for a moment, the beach fell into a pooled silence, as though even the waves waited to exhale. Minutes passed, not many, but enough to stretch long across the raw nerves of the night, before the distant thrum of helicopter rotors rolled across the horizon. The sound grew in widening circles, pushing aside the quiet like a tide reclaiming its shore. A beacon swept the water, slicing across the dark surface in ribbons of white. The helicopter descended, wind from its blades flattening the waves and blowing sand across Jonas's boots in soft, stinging sprays. When the rescue crew touched down, their silhouettes moved with calm urgency, their voices steady, their hands sure. They lifted Liam onto a stretcher with practiced care, They helped Marin into a thermal blanket, her body shaking not from cold, but from release. The moment her fear folded back into relief. She reached for Jonas, her fingers trembling around his wrist, her face streaked with salt and exhaustion. Her breath hitched once as she tried to speak, and when no words came, she simply leaned forward and held him in a brief, fierce embrace. One that carried every tremor of gratitude she couldn't articulate. Jonas rested a hand gently on her shoulder, the weight of his touch both grounding and light. "You're strong," he murmured. Just 5 soft words, but enough to steady her. She nodded once, tears bright, before the crew guided her into the helicopter. Bear stood beside Jonas, ears folding back as the rotors spun, up again, sand swirling in frantic spirals around their feet. The helicopter lifted slowly, rising into the dim wash of the final evening light, its search beam fading as it carried Marin and Liam away from the island's grip. Then the beach went still. The wind quieted, the waves softened, and the last orange glow of day unfurled across the water, painting the surface in shades of fire and memory. Jonas stood with Bear at his side, the two of them framed by the vastness of sea and sky, their shadows stretching toward the forest that had tested them and, somehow, returned them changed. Jonas inhaled, and the quiet wrapped around him. Not the suffocating silence he once feared, but a gentler, deeper lull, the kind that feels like a hand resting briefly on the heart. He looked out at the horizon, where the helicopter had vanished into fading light, and something in his chest loosened. Not triumph, not the sharp relief of survival. Something quieter, something earned. A reminder that even the most fractured parts of a person could be mended, if not by time, then by the simple grace of choosing to stay, to fight, to return. The world did not roar in celebration. It did not blaze with glory. It only breathed around him, soft and steady. Loyalty, courage, kindness, and the quiet heroes who carry those things without asking for witness. Jonas placed a hand on Bear's fur, and together they stood in the cooling sand as the last light folded away, leaving a promise behind in its place. There are moments in life that don't arrive with thunder or triumph, but with a quiet breath, the kind that settles gently on the heart before you even notice it. Stories like this remind us of those moments, of the soft places where courage hides, and the quiet corners where loyalty waits without asking for applause. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The steady rhythm of someone choosing kindness when no one is watching. The quiet bravery of a soul who steps forward simply because it's the right thing to do. These are not the heroes carved in stone or written into headlines. They are the ones who mend the world in small, steadfast ways, stitch by stitch, moment by moment. And maybe that's why their stories stay with us, because they whisper a truth we sometimes forget, that even in the loneliest places, goodness does not disappear. It endures, it returns, it finds us. So as the final light fades and the world grows still again, let this be the echo that remains. A reminder of loyalty that does not waver, courage that does not shout, and compassion that moves quietly across the sand, carried by those who keep watch when the rest of us are asleep. May we honor them by seeing them. May we honor them by becoming a little more like them.